Thomas Ennett and Ellen Milner, both English immigrants to America, met and married in Rockford, Illinois in 1857. The couple had 10 children together, but Ellen's mental health issues required her to be hospitalized multiple times before her death in 1897. In August of 1898, their son George, himself occasionally acting peculiar after experiencing a head injury a decade before, shot his sister Anna to death before turning the gun on himself. Welcome to an audio version of an original article by Kathi Kresol, operator of Haunted Rockford Paranormal Events, Rockford, Illinois. This audio presentation is entitled Wings of Madness and contains the 2015 story of the same name. The story originally appeared in Murder Mayhem in Rockford, Illinois by Kathi Kresol. This audio article is produced by Thomas Saunders for Haunted Rockford. Thomas Ennett was born on the Isle of Man on August 12, 1831. He learned his trade as a mason and contractor on the great water wheel of Laxey on the Isle of Man. This water wheel, which is used for running the Manx mines, was the greatest work of its kind in the world for many years. Thomas arrived in Rockford, Illinois on May 8, 1853. There he met Ellen Milner. Ellen was born in Sawley, Yorkshire, England on October 6, 1833. She traveled to America in 1849 and settled in Rockford. The couple married in 1857. Ellen was 24 years old that year. Thomas continued his trade as a mason when he arrived in Rockford and eventually built his own business, Ennett and Sons. He assisted with the original Rockford Police Building, St. Mary's Catholic Church, St. James Catholic Church, the original First Presbyterian Church, and many businesses throughout the city. He was well known and very well respected for the fine workmanship he brought to the building trade. Thomas and Ellen had 10 children together. Thomas constructed a home for them on North 2nd Street, a beautiful brick building that is still standing. Ellen died on January 28, 1897, in her home. Unfortunately, she had been an invalid for many years before her passing. Ellen gave birth to all 10 of her children and considered herself to be a blessed woman when they all lived to adulthood. Ellen and Thomas were proud of their extensive family. Thomas must have been relieved to have such a caring family, especially when the girls stepped in to help run the family after Ellen started to have her troubles. Ellen had mental health issues, and at times became so difficult that she had to be placed in an asylum in Joliet, a fact that tortured the family. But Ellen was really the lucky one because she passed away before the dark times came to her family. She never saw the destruction that was to come. In 1898, the Ennett family was doing well. Ellen had passed away, but the family had pulled together. 8 out of the 10 children still lived at home, and none of them had married yet. Neighbors and friends would describe the family as very close. In fact, one said that they had never seen a family which seemed to live for one another more than the Ennetts did. The family was so good at running things that Thomas took an extended vacation to the Isle of Man, returning on August 2, 1898. August 16, 1898 was, by all accounts, a typical day in the Ennett household. At least that is how the day started. By the end of the day, nothing would ever be the same for the family. Thomas and Ellen's first child was George, who was born in 1861 in Rockford. When he became an adult, he was considered a talented mechanic. Folks around Rockford knew that if it moved or had moving parts, George Ennett was the man to take it to if it needed repairs. George was very active and enjoyed the outdoors, spending considerable time hunting and fishing. Sometime around 1888, George had an accident. He was working on one of his father's many properties and took a bad fall, striking his head on the stonework that surrounded the yard. That injury changed George's personality. He didn't want to travel, hunt, or fish anymore, preferring to stay at home. He also read a lot, especially history books. Neighbors noticed the difference in George and called him peculiar. Not that anyone said anything to his family, least of all his father. Thomas Ennett was too highly respected in Rockford for that. George seemed harmless enough. He never quarreled with anyone. He just didn't go out much and seemed to get depressed a lot. George was considered good and kind, except when he ran out of tobacco for the pipe he was constantly puffing on. Neighbors also noticed that his sister Anna had a way to get George out of his dark moods faster than anyone else in the family. It was obvious to everyone that she was his favorite. Anna was the second born and was 35 years of age in 1898. She assumed the mother role after Ellen became ill and couldn't function anymore. Anna worked very hard to make sure the household operated smoothly, and she never complained. During the morning of August 16th, everyone had gone their separate ways to work on their daily jobs. The only thing different about that day was that George and his youngest sister, Nellie, spent the morning cleaning up the yard and the surrounding properties their father owned. There had been a storm the evening before, and there was debris in the yards. George was teasing Nellie because she was so slow at sweeping the sticks from the sidewalks. The family had dinner together on that August day. Back in 1898, the big meal was served at lunchtime. Thomas gave the children their jobs for the afternoon and went upstairs to his office. Joseph was at the firehouse. William was in Wisconsin on a hunting trip. And Samuel, John, Fred, and Charles, all of whom worked at the Ennett and Sons contractors with their father, went back to work. Mary was on the second floor of the house sewing, and Nellie and Anna were in the basement helping Mrs. Nord, the woman they hired to help with the laundry. Thomas asked George to clean the cellar of one of the homes they owned. George nodded his assent and climbed the stairs to his room to change into his work clothes. Nellie later said the women were working in the basement, washing and wringing out the clothes with their backs to the doorway. Nellie didn't even turn around when she heard George come down the stairs. The next thing she heard was a loud gunshot. She was so startled that she fell to the ground. She had just hit the ground when there was another shot. Nellie was sure she was hit, but scrambled out the side door to the basement on her hands and knees. She stated she had never been so frightened. She made it around to the front of the house where she started screaming for her father. Thomas, hearing his daughter's screams, ran out into the street where Nellie told him that George had shot at her and Anna. Thomas headed back toward the house when he heard a third shot sound from the basement. By this time, neighbors were startled by the shots and ran to see what was happening. They would testify later that they saw gun smoke rising from the open basement windows and doors. Thomas ran back into the house, followed by his neighbors, Dr. Soey and Henry Pawson. They ran into one of the rooms and were shocked to see George sitting in a chair, his head thrown back and the left side of his face completely gone. The neighbors stayed in the room, which was blotted with blood and brains on the walls and pictures, but Thomas ran frantically from the room up into the main portion of the house, calling Anna's name. He thought that she might have escaped the basement, like her sister. He found his daughter Mary on the second floor, sitting at her sewing machine. She was shaking and obviously upset, but otherwise unhurt. He ran through every room of the house and found no sign of Anna. Then, more slowly, Thomas returned to the basement washing room, where he stumbled on the body of his eldest daughter. The damage to her was significant. George had leveled the shotgun to the back of her neck. The projectile exited through her mouth and tore away the whole lower part of her face. The neighbor had already found Anna and described the scene later to the police. It was a pathetic sight to see her laying as she did by the side of the implements of her daily toil, her frame slight and bent from the burden of care that it had borne for so long, and her hands that had toiled so hard for her loved ones, now still in death. Mrs. Nord, who had stood beside Anna, wringing out the clothes, was obviously in shock. She had not registered anything and was still wringing out the wet clothing as if the last few minutes had never happened. Henry Pawson ran to alert the coroner and the police and to call Joseph home from the firehouse. Coroner Frank Marsh arrived at the scene and examined the bodies. Coroner Marsh later determined that after Thomas told George to go clean the other cellar, he walked up the stairs to his room, loaded his shotgun, and put extra shells into his shirt pocket. He then walked back down the stairs to where his sisters were working. George raised the barrel and shot Anna at such a close range that there was stippling around the wound. Next, he turned his gun toward Nellie, who had fallen to the floor, and aimed where he thought she was standing and fired again. The gun discharged so much smoke that he didn't realize that she had not been hit. George then went into an adjoining room and placed a chair in the center of the room. He sat down and took off his shoe, pulled off his sock, placed the gun between his knees, and laid the left side of his head down on the muzzle. He used his big toe to pull the trigger. The papers were allowed into the crime scenes back then, and the reporter who covered this story wrote, "George sent the spirit of his sister Anna into eternity And there, seated in his chair with his head thrown back, was George Ennett, a pool of blood on the floor beside him and a shotgun between his knees. The bodies of George and Anna were carried to an upstairs room, and the coroner and a family friend prepared them for burial. The bodies were in such awful condition that it took Coroner Marsh several hours to prepare them. Coroner Marsh conducted an inquest around 5 o'clock that evening in the same room as the bodies. The jury questioned several witnesses and carefully listened as Nellie lived through the horrendous events again as she told the tale. No one was surprised by the verdict. Anna was murdered by her brother George, who then turned the gun on himself in an act of suicide. It must have been a streak of mental aberration that he inherited from his mother and intensified by his secluded life. What circumstances fanned the murderous passion into a flame no man can say, was the jury's final word on the tragedy. The family held a double funeral in the home and brought both of the deceased to Cedar Bluff Cemetery to rest near their mother and each other. This was a turning point for what had been up to now a blessed family. One might hope that the family would be able to put this time of trouble behind them and go on to live happy lives. The family seemed to remain close, but though most of them found happiness, trouble seemed to stalk the others. Thomas died in 1908 and left the family home to his son William, born in 1873. William worked at the Parson Lumber Company until 1917, when he abruptly sold the home, which had been in his family for over 50 years, the house his father had built with his own hands. William did not explain this action to the rest of his siblings. He simply told the family he was leaving, and they would never see him again. He left Rockford for parts unknown. In 1947, 30 years after his bizarre disappearance, the family filed a petition to have him declared dead. Mary, born in 1865, lived until the age of 65 and died on November 11, 1930. She never married and kept house for her brothers Charles and Samuel. Charles, born in 1867, lived until 1944 when he was 77 years old. He seemed to live a happy life after his retirement. He spent most of his days fishing. In fact, he was returning from a fishing trip on the Rock River and pushing his boat and trailer up the street toward home when he suffered a heart attack and died in front of 200 Market Street. Joseph was born on August 12, 1869. He worked for a time with his father as a stonemason and also as a fireman. He married Margaret Higgins in 1899. They had 3 children, Beatrice, Francis, and Thomas. His name is in the papers quite a lot as he expanded his father's business. Joseph moved to Long Beach, California for health reasons in August 1920. He died there in 1921, and his brother Samuel brought him and his family home. Joseph was only 51 years old. Samuel lived until 83 years of age and was considered very healthy for his age. In January 1947, he died when he fell down the back stairs in his home on 630 North Court Street. Another son, John, also known as Jack, born in 1871, was mentioned in the newspaper many times for fighting and drunkenness. When he drank, he would lose control, yelling, marching around downtown, and going on rampages. He even shot a neighbor's horse during one of his fits. He died in 1951 at the age of 80. He was buried away from the rest of the family in Willwood Burial Park. Nellie, born in 1876, the other attempted victim of that brutal August day, made a good life for herself. She married Henry Perkins, and when she passed away in May 1959, she left an estate worth $70,000. Fred Ennett, born in 1877, was not so fortunate. After a series of failed business ventures, he killed himself in the barn of his home on Market Street on December 2nd, 1924. The family claimed that it was murder, and they looked to have a good case for a while. Their main evidence was that Fred had been shot 3 times. He was shot 2 times in the body and once in the head. The bullet entered under his chin and exited his cheek. His funeral was held at his brother Samuel's house on Court Street. The Ennett family's legacy does not only include death and murder, though. A few of the buildings that Thomas and his sons built are still standing today, a tribute to their quality and design. This is the end of our audio article. Thanks for listening.